everyone. So I just had to turn on my phone version of Zoom because the way that Keynote works, it isn't the most friendly for seeing your screens while you're presenting. So Zoom and Keynote just really don't really help out Q&A. But now I have it on my phone, so any questions that you put in Q&A, I'll have in front of me, and I'll be able to kind of keep my eye on chat as well. So let me go ahead and share screen and then start my presentation, which you may actually see a little chubby baby first. But I swear there's content coming through.
He's so cute.
All right. Thank you. That was when he first started eating. I would just hand him avocados.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So today we are talking about, we're basically having a render refresher. And like Brooke said, this is on November 16th, which is a Monday, 10 a.m. Mountain Time, where I'm going to be leading a workshop on actually going through rendering options by working through the code. So this is kind of like the first phase of that workshop. So if you can join us, that would be great. But I hope you get a lot of valuable information out of this as well. This is what I call on my team, I call these talkie dockies. So this is basically, we're going to be talking a lot and doing a lot of high level, as well as looking at resources to follow up with, and a lot of docs that help us guide our thought process through what things are before we actually jump into code. So this is the talkie docky part. And again, November 16th, Monday. It's a free workshop, so I hope to see you there. You may be saying, who is this person talking to me? Again, as Rick said, I'm Tara Minixick. I'm a senior developer experience engineer at Netlify. I'm an Angular Google developer expert and a self-proclaimed nerdy mom of that furball there, the round human there, and then another one on the way in February. So I've just tried to teach them, all three of them, Rubik's Cube as soon as they can get their hands on it, and trying to get them to understand async await. So that's a bit about me. But I want to jump into what we're going to be covering today. Let me get these Zoom controls out of my way. There we go. So first, I just want to talk about these different rendering options, talk about rendering in general. So we're going to be talking about universal rendering and statics, or SSR. SSR is kind of a more encompassing term than we're kind of used to seeing. So that will be a path of rendering in itself. And then I basically want to talk about this like overarching kind of rendering, and then talk about a certain product in particular. So with universal rendering, we're going to be talking about Angular Universal. And then from there, we'll talk about pre-rendering and serverless functions, which is another approach that is mostly used by the Jamstack architecture, which we'll touch on. And then the product that we'll talk about for that one will be Netlify functions. We'll probably spend most of the time talking about serverless functions and the pre-rendering aspects, and only touch on Netlify functions a bit, because that, again, is a more in-depth code, kind of the best way to really wrap your mind around which rendering options will work best for you is to actually code it out. But before we code, I think it's really important to understand the surrounding concepts and what each of these things are, let alone just the words, because I feel like that's what really trips us up a lot, is that we have things like serverless, which does not mean there are less servers or no servers. We tend to, unfortunately, kind of confuse ourselves with a lot of the terminology. So I like to make sure we have that straight before we get started. So speaking of, I want to touch on a few words that we'll be using today that you may see all around everywhere. And I want to make sure that we have a really grounded understanding of what they are. So in regards to performance and rendering, there we go. There is time to first byte. I put all the acronyms here because that's what we'll sometimes use in writing, but I will never say TTFB. I will say time to first byte. So time to first byte is the time between when the user is interacting with your site and doing things like clicking a navigation link, or trying to have some interaction inside of the content you have on your page. So it's the time between that and between that actual very first byte of data that comes through. So this is basically, all of these phrases in general are just ways for us to have analytics and to know what, like at what point things are happening. Then we have first paint. This is the first pixel getting rendered. So this is when the user starts to actually see something coming through. Then there's first contentful paint. And when this is basically when the content that the user requested, like the body of a blog post or an image, when does that come through so the user can actually see it on the page? When is it rendered? Then there is time to interactive, TTI. So I think we talk about this one a lot because as we'll see with some of the other rendering approaches, having the user be able to see things is great, but if they see it and can't interact, it could be frustrating. So this is basically what is the time in between the user actually saying, please give me this page of content, and then the user is actually able to interact with that page by, clicking a link or being able to trigger any kind of event on that page. So those are the main things that we'll talk about for each of these rendering options, or some of the main terminology that we may not be as used to. All that prepares us for actually talking about what we're going to be about, the different types of rendering. So as with most things, we have this term like universal rendering or SSR, but what are the actual pieces inside of that? So one of the best things you can do, as I think we all know, in development, in computer science, is taking something big and breaking it down. So when we break down universal rendering, first we start out with server rendering. So server rendering is this process that creates all of the HTML for a page on the server. And this is in response to when a user or navigation is requesting that page. So when a click happens to request this information. So this will give you a fast first paint and a fast first contentful paint. So when you're doing this server rendering and producing that HTML on the server, you're doing it on demand for each URL. It can be slower than just serving static rendered content, which we'll talk about more in depth later. But that kind of just makes sense. When you have static content, there are less calls being made to actually render. You're just giving that small package that's already been rendered static content. So it can be slower. And you have to put some additional work into maybe doing that server rendering and then also caching that HTML. And that will massively reduce your server render time if you're able to cache things locally that you have already rendered, if they're re-requesting a page they have already seen. Just a heads up, I am going to try to talk about like the bonuses and the downfalls of each of these things, because there is no silver bullet for for rendering, just like there is no silver bullet for latency. These are just things that problems that we always kind of have to go through as developers. So we'll just talk about the different approaches. And the biggest thing of picking which one for you is like which of the pitfalls can you deal with? Can you put more work into figuring out how to do your caching, etc. So again, this server rendering is basically generating the full HTML page in the server in response, and you're avoiding these additional round trips for data fetching and templating on the client, since it's all handled before the browser even gets the response. It's all happening on the server. All that information is all that work is being done on the server, and then it gets sent to the client. Speaking of the client, client-side rendering. This is a much more common approach to rendering, and it can work just as well as server rendering if it's a small load. So with client-side rendering, everything is handled on the client side. So instead of any of the rendering or data fetching or templating happening on the server, it's all happening on the client side. The client side JavaScript is doing that. The primary downside is how much JavaScript you'll need as your application grows. So the scalability can become quite cumbersome. But again, you can handle things like this with code splitting and lazy loading, but you have to be quite fastidious about this and really keep an eye on how much JavaScript is being loaded and how that may slow things down. But again, how big is your site? Is that really going to matter to you? So now with both of those in mind, we have universal rendering or SSR. So this is the combination of server rendering and client-side rendering, and you'll be using hydration. So basically those full page loads, when you're requesting a brand new site or requesting a reload of the whole page, like it's not cached, then you'll be using that server-side rendering. But then the JavaScript and data used for the rendering is embedded into the doc on client side, so that can be used for data fetching. So again, you're going to get a fast first contentful paint. And you're basically saying you're delegating the tasks to who can handle them better. You're kind of smoothing off what the weaknesses of the other ones are with the strength of the other. You're kind of balancing it out with these two on here. But again, the dynamic nature of this in general can come with a lot of computational overhead costs. And some of the SSR solutions won't flush early and can delay time to first paint, or like even double the data that's being sent, just because you, again, have a lot of moving parts now. So these are things to take into consideration. And I also, I get tripped up about hydration. I think a lot of people do in the community. Could just be me, but just in case it's not just me, I wanted to touch on this as well. So hydration is basically saying that once you're getting that HTML that was rendered on the server, the hydration process takes inline JSON, will process the inline JSON state stored client side for data in the page, and then attach that DOM event listeners. So you're getting that HTML, and then inline JSON will give you that state stored client side. So you're regenerating the state client side used to render the page on the server. So again, like the downside of this with the SSR with hydration is that there's the negative impact on time to interactive. Even if it improves the first paint, that time to interactive can be delayed. And you may be familiar with this, because what will happen with SSR is that the page will look like it's loaded. You'll have that first time to paint. You'll see everything there, but the time to interaction hasn't happened yet. So you can't actually respond with the input until that JavaScript is executed and the event handlers have been attached. So again, like that's that interaction. It hasn't happened yet. So you may load a page and see everything on the page, but then when you try to click or try to interact with it, nothing's actually happening, which can be really confusing and really frustrating to users. I know I've definitely been there. And that's one thing, we want fast load times, but we also want to avoid any kind of frustration to users when things aren't working how they expect it. So what does this look like code-wise? So here, this is an image from a blog post that I'm going to share with you right after this slide from Jason Miller and Adi Asmani, called Rendering on the Web. But so they basically push out this information here. So you see that you have that head content above. And again, it's not flushed early due to the possible mutation by the server rendering. And then that section in there, that first part is the body that you see with the headers and like so content that you would see on the page. That's that static HTML of the page that was requested. And so it's usually not moving due to the use of JavaScript event handlers. Then underneath that, we have that data required to render the view. And the view is already rendered above it, right? And then you have at the bottom that JavaScript to boot up. So the server is returning a description of the UI because it was requested by the user, but it's also returning that source data that it used to make the UI and a complete copy of the UI's implementation, which will then boot up on the client. So only after that bottom script, that bundle.js, has finished loading and executing, that's when it becomes interactive. So you see there's a lot happening before that actual interaction, even though people are able to see it. So that's like we just talked about with that confusion of interaction. If you read any post that I suggest today, this is definitely the one that I highly recommend. It's on developers.google.com in their web updates section. Again, it's by Jason Miller, the creator of Preact, and Adi Zamani, just like the most beloved web developer relations representative at Google, because he's got such informative content like this one here, rendering on the web. If you look over to that right side, you can see everything that's covered in this. And so here they talk about the different terminology, and they go into talking about just those different combinations of rendering, again, with giving examples. And then they talk about different types of rendering that are kind of being worked on as well. So with all of that in mind, with all that kind of rendering knowledge ruminating in your head, I want to talk about Angular Universal. I feel that you may have at least heard about Angular Universal. It's not, it's not as used as just like in general the Angular CLI, and it's mostly pointed to as the server-side rendering tool for Angular. So this is the site. This is what you'll find on angular.io when you look into the server-side rendering aspect of Angular. And every main framework and library has a server-side rendering approach, and this is Angular's. So it's a technology that renders Angular applications on the server. I want to kind of jump in a little more to what that means. So normally Angular uses that client-side rendering. So it's basically executing in the browser and rendering pages in the DOM, client-side rendering. And it does this when a user requests that content and that data. It does it on the fly based on those requests. And then Angular Universal basically generates these static app pages in the server, like we said, with that server-side rendering generating HTML. And then they're eventually bootstrapped on the client. Let's dig a little bit deeper. So again, we're not going to actually walk through the code for all of this, but I wanted to show a little bit of the steps that you take and kind of talk you through the things that are happening when you put Angular Universal into play. So with your existing Angular application, you run ng-add, so that's the command for the Angular schematics to add different modules into your Angular application. And you're using ng-universal /express engine. Once you do that, your files will be changed in this way. So right there is the file list, and inside you see where the asterisks are. Those are the new things, the new files being added to your application. So we have that bootstrapper for the server app, like we do right above it. That main.typescript is the bootstrap for the client app. Then we have inside of our app folder that server-side application module. So we won't look into that actual code today, but we will at the workshop if you're interested, November 16th. And then server.typescript is the Express web server. So again, that's a Node library helping you easily create web servers. And then once you have that all added, you just need to run your usual npm run dev, and then :SSR for that server-side rendering aspect of it. But what all is happening? So when you run the npm run dev SSR, a universal web server responds to that request, to the application's request, with static HTML rendered of your application by the universal template engine. And what is the universal template engine? So I'm gonna talk through this, but it's just to kind of start this brainworm. But we'll actually look at these functions in the workshop. So this is the Universal Web Server it takes that ng-express engine function, the one that's talking to that express server, and it's a wrapper around Angular Universal's render module function, which turns the client request. So we always have this render module function inside of our Angular applications. We then have a wrapper for it that makes the client request now a server rendered HTML pages. So it turns that what we would have the client request be into a server request. So that's all happening behind the scenes. And then a universal application will use the Angular's platform server package. So in comparison to a regular Angular application, we use the platform browser. This one will use platform server. And so this will basically provide a server implementation of the DOM, of XML HTTP request, and a bunch of other kind of lower level features that do not rely on the browser. So it's almost like we're transitioning, like we kind of have this hybrid solution of we can run it regularly and be using what we usually use in the browser for the DOM and for the XML HTTP request and such, or we can switch over to SSR and use these non-browser reliant versions of these features. So it's very parallel. And so that's a good thing to keep in mind, is like we're not straying too far away from our usual. So then once we have all of those functions working on the server instead of the browser, we're saying, hey, server, pass this client request for the application to ng-universal and ng-express engine. And when it gets that request, it says, okay, I'm going to call Universal's render module function and provide caching and other helpful utilities, as well as the static rendered version of your site. So each request that you're sending will give you the appropriate view for that requested route. And then that render module function renders the view within that app tag, again, like we're used to with Angular. And it creates that HTML page for the client. So all of those things are happening on the server, and then it sends the client that rendered page. So all the work happens on the server, but you get the same content rendered for the user that you would have seen if we used all of our browser-centric tools. So it's a pretty long route to get to that point. And again, that kind of gives you the steps, but we'll be actually walking through every one of those steps in the workshop. So in general, why would we use server-side rendering with Angular Universal if we're pretty much getting the same outcome? So one thing that's always kind of been a bit of a splinter for Angular is the fact of being able to take advantage of web crawlers for search engine optimization. And this is another huge aspect to when people choose how they want to render their applications, because so like Angular Universal will basically generate a static version of your app, and that makes it easy to search, easy to link, and easy to navigate without JavaScript. So it's it also makes a site preview, which is available since each URL returns a fully rendered page. So all of these web crawlers for all of your search engines will be able to see a lot more information from your site, because so much of it is already rendered and easy for those web crawlers to crawl through. So even though you may be able to, on other applications that don't use this, see some things on the page, the content may not be there for the web crawlers to understand it fully like us brilliant humans can. So another aspect is improving the performance on mobile and lower powered devices. So this is a good thing to think about for the accessibility of your application, because yes, there may be some things out there that aren't using JavaScript in general, but then more often than not, you may have slow execution of JavaScript. So you may need to have a server rendered or a no JavaScript version of your application. And also, being able to show that first page quickly with a first contentful paint. Response time is very important for user engagement, and I think that we hear this and it's drilled into us very early on in web development. And this is because this is where you can lose money or not get money that should be coming to you, because I had to explain this to one of my aunts the other day, because she was asking like, why is it such a big deal? I was talking to her about what Netlify does. And she was like, well, why is it a big deal that users can see your page faster? And it's basically the whole aspect of you search for a sweater and you see the listings come through and you click on the first one because you want to buy a sweater and it doesn't come through. The page doesn't load fast, so you just go back and hit the next link. So in that, in those milliseconds of making that choice, that first page lost your money. So money, that's why it's important. She liked that response. That worked for her. One of the final things, very much to me, not the least, is that Angular Universal, you're still just using Angular. Developer experience is very important, and we have to learn more and more things with every new technology we use. So why trouble yourself with learning a whole new language or, having to learn some new framework when you can just be using Angular? And on top of it, Angular Universal does a lot of, like we talked about the caching and stuff, does a lot of that work for you. So, which is one of the major benefits of Angular in general. It's like how much work gets done for you by the framework, have your tools work for you. There are some bumps. So they talk about this in the documentation. This is all listed there very clearly. So some of the browser APIs and capabilities may be missing on the server because a universal app, the execution doesn't happen in the browser. So there are some of those browser APIs that you may not have at your disposal. So like without mouse or keyboard events, a server-side app can't rely on the user clicking a button to show a component. But Angular provides some abstractions. And so you're able to, like they have location or document, which could be good substitutes for some of these APIs. And you also are able to write new abstractions that delegate to the browser APIs while in the browser. And give you the ability to have an alternate implementation. So you're able to be doing some shimming. But that's like not right out of the box easy things to do. So it is a bump in the road. And the app has to determine what to render based solely on the incoming client request. So they always suggest making the app routable. But a thing that is really troubling for me is the fact that the page that I showed you is the only page that exists, or is like the main page that exists in documentation for Angular Universal. And Angular Universal is a very powerful and intricate tool, or technology. So I would love to see more documentation on Angular Universal because the learning curve can be a bit bumpy. So more documentation would be great. The code is there. It's all open source. You can go check it out. But I really hate it when people are like, just read the code. You want to figure out what it does, just read the code. And it's like, do you know how much time I have in a day? So more documentation would be great, which they're doing a lot of work on the Angular documentation in general. So it'll be great to see how advancements go with Angular Universal, especially the pre-rendering aspect of Angular Universal. Speaking of, I want to talk about pre-rendering and serverless functions. So we talked about this a bit. There's a bit of overlap with that pre-rendering and server-side rendering is we're trying to get just HTML rendered from the dynamic content that we make with Angular. Pre-rendering is basically rendering content at build time. So that's the major difference. The content is being rendered, being transformed into a static asset at build time. So when it comes to requesting, we're not even talking to servers. We're not even trying to make any requests. We're just serving up static content. This definitely proves first paint and first contentful paint. And it must be booted on the client in order for the pages to be truly interactive. But this can be challenging and even infeasible when if you have to predict what every single URL is supposed to be ahead of time, especially for pages or sites with a large number of unique pages. But we're going to be talking about how there are solutions to that already coming through. But just that's a good bump to think about with pre-rendering is, do you have hundreds of thousands of pages that you're going to be rendering at build time? Do you have that kind of build time to, do you know that you have to have things rebuilt all the time, or can you have a specific rebuild time or a specific build time? But again, all of these things are coming to developers' heads, and the ecosystem is answering these questions. So we'll touch on that in a little bit. But I want to say that there are a few approaches to pre-rendering in Angular that exist at the moment. There is actually utilizing a segment of Angular Universal with Angular pre-render module built by Chris. It's basically taking this pre-render functionality that happens in Angular Universal and abstracting it to just do that pre-rendering part for you. It's a really easy setup as well. We'll talk about this in the workshop, but again, you don't see this in the documentation. They talk about how on the server it makes that static asset, the HTML asset, but it's actually using a pre-render function. And Chris did the work of digging into the code to find it, but hopefully we see some documentation about that in the near future. And we have Scully now. This is the first and only static site generator for Angular, and it is a really great, simple way to pre-render your application and give you a lot of ways to work with, like Markdown, having basically a plugin system to really make your site work faster. And it's a Jamstack approach, which we'll also touch on. But highly recommend checking out Scully. We'll talk about that and use that a lot more in the workshop. But what is a static site generator? Just so I make sure that we're kind of covering all these topics. A static site generator is basically what we talked about with that pre-rendering, of generating all of the pages for the whole site once at build time. And then when there's a change, it will regenerate all of those. And every major framework and language has one. But when you're doing that static content, we say that every time there's a change, you rebuild the whole site, but you're actually able to cache a lot of that. So we can look at different build plugins to see what actually changed, what actually needs generated. So to make your build time faster. This is one of the approaches that's like evolving. And it's harder to hack plain HTML. And it gets to the user much faster because it's not making those requests and it's a smaller bundle. So I touched on the Jamstack architecture. I give whole talks on this. I have some resources at the end that I will guide you to, but I want to give you a really high-level overview. The Jamstack architecture is basically taking concepts that we're already used to and pulling them together to give you like the faster and more reliable and secure sites with an easier integration process for developers, and then lower costs and confusions when it comes to set up an infrastructure. But here are the bullet points. You're basically generating cacheable static assets, and we would do things like with Angular. This is where Angular comes in. So we'd make an Angular site and pre-render it with Scully or with Angular Universal's pre-render functionality. Then we would deploy it to a CDN, a content delivery network. So we're not on the traditional server architecture. but a more dumbed down version of that has edge nodes closer to people requesting them. And then using client-side JavaScript, like we're going to be talking about serverless functions and Netlify functions to utilize APIs, serverless functions. And then also, again, I care very much about developer experience because I'm a developer and I like developers. So I care very much about their experience. And so they do this with kind of a Git workflow and doing automated workflows, automated builds, and easy to roll back to immutable builds, things like that. Again, I'm going to give you a bunch of references if you want to learn more about this, and I'm always happy to chat about it. I drank the Kool-Aid and it was delicious. I'm a huge fan of Jamstack architecture. So if you ever want to chat about it, let me know. Real quick, because we touched on some aspects that may not be quick to mind definitions. CDN, it's Content Delivery Network, and these are geographically distributed edge nodes. So they are like dumb servers that hold, we can say dumb servers because we talk about dumb components all the time, right? But they're these nodes that hold the deliverable assets, so those static assets that we make, and it's sent from an origin server, but then it serves it as close to the user requesting it as possible to try and limit that latency. And then it also has redirect knowledge. So if something happens to that node, it knows to send it to the next closest one. So you have that redundancy, making it more reliable. And then another thing that we talked about that we're going to delve into are serverless functions. So again, this does not mean that there are no servers. I like to say it's serverless, worryless, because you're basically using the same functionality as a server, but serverless tries to take away the actual management of that technology. So serverless functions are basically a single purpose function that you as the developer make, and then it's hosted, maintained, and executed by an infrastructure or cloud computing company. So it's JavaScript functions hosted and maintained by infrastructure providers. So there are a lot of these that exist out there. Azure functions, Google, is it just Google functions? I think it's Google Cloud Functions. AWS Lambda is one that's quite popular as well. And I have this really great post. Like I said, I'm dumping a lot of information on you. So I want to make sure that I give you resources to take with you so you can read more into this. And again, in the workshop, we'll take all the information that I've dumped on you, and then you've had like a few weeks to process and then put it into action. But if you want to learn anything, check out Learn with Jason. This is my coworker, Jason Langsdorf's child. And he's got blog posts on here, but also he does Twitch streams with really amazing people to help you learn more things as he's learning it. And he has this blog post, What are serverless functions and how do I use them? He's got a lot of great content that walks you through using them, and I'll point to some of that at the end in the resource section as well. But this is a great introduction to serverless functions and what's happening and why it's happening. And I just want to touch on these really quickly because I think people don't realize how much you can actually do with serverless functions talking to different APIs. So I just want to touch on each of these aspects that can happen with using pre-rendering plus serverless functions to talk to these APIs. You can get data with, this is AWS AppSync, Firestore, which many of you may be used to using, MongoDB, FaunaDB, Realm, Airtable, and Hasura. All of these use APIs that you can talk to with serverless functions. So this is how you get data. Then there's also headless CMSs. I want to talk about what this phrase is. A headless CMS is a backend-only content management system for making your content available through an API. So it's taking that UI that especially content contributors are used to using, like the forms that say, enter the text, enter the picture, and it takes that off of that backend data side that the developer needs to use. So it says, here, give me the information that you want me to store. I don't care what you do with it. I and happy to deliver the content wherever you need it. And so basically, it's really great because you can have this content put in by things that you may be familiar with, like there's headless WordPress, and there's Flamelink for Firebase. So you have all of, and Contentful, and Strap. There's a bunch of them. So again, you're able to pre-render, have all that static content, use those serverless functions to talk to these APIs and make it dynamic. A lot of people say that with those pre-rendered and like static rendered sites, you don't have the as dynamic as you would with server-side renderings. But these are the things with serverless functions that you're able to do that, like with authentication and things again that you might be used to, like Auth0 and Firebase. We have Netlify Identity, which I'll touch on. You can even do e-commerce with things like that's Snipcart and Stripe and PayPal and Square, and even search with things like Algolia, and even doing Google custom searches and Cloud SH. So I wanted to talk about those so that you just had a really quick grasp of the actual functionality that you can perform without having to, with being able to use those serverless functions. So I just want to touch on what this looks like how we jumped into Angular Universal. I kind of just want to show you what it looks like to use something like Netlify functions. These are basically, they're a wrapper around AWS Lambda functions. So you have all these capabilities that you have with these functions, but we're trying to take back the time that gets sent into all of the setups, all of the ops, all of that backend infrastructure work that you have to understand and execute to do those Lambda functions on the server. So again, we're basically saying like, here, give us the function that you want to use. We'll have that just saved and rendered. So you have it there. We're not talking to this, we're sending this information out, this JavaScript information out to perform your action. And I have this post that walks you through this whole process, but I want to show you the code of how to authenticate users in Angular using Netlify Identity, which uses the Netlify functions, which is the serverless function. So what does this look like? So like we were doing with that server-side rendering that talked to the servers, what does it look like when we do it at this route and this way of rendering? So here you see, this is just your Angular's index.html file that's in your root directory. The only thing that I added in here is the script section that says, go to the source is this identity.netlify widget. This is an open source project, so feel free to go check out Netlify Identity widget. We have all of our information there. My team maintains it. And then inside of my navigation component, I just had to add this div that's login and passes the data Netlify Identity button. So that's all the code I needed to add. And this is what it looks like. Basically, I added that information. I went and I enabled it on the UI. It says it's enabled. I refresh the page. In that top right section, you see now I have a login button. And when I click it, users have the ability to sign up and get their information in there to sign up. But they also are able to log in and use a bunch of third-party providers. Like, see if I walk through it. I can enable Google login, GitHub login by adding these external providers. So it's basically just clicking these options, and all of this is happening behind the scenes with serverless functions. So when I go back to the page and I hit login and I have that all that information there, the content on the page is pre-rendered. So all of that's coming through, and then I'm pushing in these aspects with serverless functions to get that dynamic information. So you see how fast that went through, and we'll look at all of the actual page load times in the workshop. But so those are kind of like what we have that exists now, readily available to us. But the future is bringing a lot more. We won't go in depth about these because, as with all technology in our realm, the future is not guaranteed. So we're not going to fill our brains with too many details on these, but there is work being done with all of these. So streaming, server rendering, and I think Netflix actually currently uses something like this, where you're sending HTML in chunks that the browser can progressively render as it's received, which is a really fast first paint and first contentful paint, as it arrives to the user faster because it's coming through in chunks. And like the name suggests, progressive rehydration, where you're progressively hydrating your site, and then partial rehydration, where you're only picking and choosing what is actually being hydrated. And then there are edge handlers. This is the one that I'm excited about because I really like the approach of working with the CDNs, and that it's that Jamstack approach. And basically what these are how we talked about having those edge nodes on the CDN with the redirect knowledge. Inside that redirect knowledge, you can now feed a JavaScript function that will take all of the header information coming in from requests, and without ever going back to a server, without ever making a server call or a call to the origin server, it takes that request and processes that JavaScript functionality, get it and using that header information. So you can do a lot of really cool things as far as like localized content. So if a user is requesting information from San Francisco, that information is in the header. So you could pass that information to your JavaScript function that says, what's the location? Okay, give me this pre-rendered content that I already have that's labeled for that location. So California gets the California page. Montreal gets the Montreal page. Like, it's all very specific to localizations. But then you can also do like A/B testing. So you're splitting your visitors across multiple versions of the content dependent on their requests, as well as personalized ads and ads based on time, the time of day that's coming through in that header. So that is an extremely exciting future, in my opinion, because it's basically, I'm sorry if you can hear that. My dog has just started snoring. Yes, she's bored of my talk. But so we're basically being able to take something like a CDN, which is a dumb server, and we're taking something quite dumb and making it very powerful without adding too much complication. We're just adding JavaScript. Not that JavaScript can't be complicated, but usually we don't want to make something dumb very powerful. But in this case, it really helps us out because we're still having that simplified infrastructure and lowered costs compared to the traditional server setup. So that's kind of what the future is. But I want to take these last few minutes to point you to some resources that I think are very helpful. Again, that blog post that I mentioned before from Jason and Addie, it's just a really great overview and a nice quick read to really kind of just push more of that rendering information into your head and let it absorb a little more. Because this is rendering in general can be quite complicated. This is a graph that comes in that blog post that helps you understand like all the different aspects that you want to take into consideration when you were choosing how to render your application. And there's no specific one that talks about the second section that we discussed with doing the pre-rendering plus serverless functions, but you can kind of get a gist of that from some of these because we talk about server rendering here and how the pros there, you get that time to interaction and that first content paint. And then you can like easily see in front of you the cons. I think it was really, really great of them to make a table like this, but this will definitely help for any questions you may have about which one to use for your site. Like, take these things in consideration of what is okay for you to kind of have for for your page's downfalls and what things you can overcome and what you have time for. I also wanted to point out the Netlify blog. We have a lot of content on here where we talk about using serverless functions to talk to APIs. I highly recommend checking it out. It's just at netlify.com/blog. Jason has some really great ones where he talks about doing gated content with redirects and serverless functions. And we also have Netlify Identity blog post for helping you understand how you can set user roles and how you can set content based on that redirect CDN knowledge instead of having to kind of make these trips to the server to get that information for users. But we're always releasing more and more information out there, and we are currently doing a big push to kind of get more information as far as rendering in that way. And I'm always happy to make any content in regards to Angular and Jamstack and those kind of approaches. You just have to let me know. And then another really great one is from Chris Porter, made this on CSS tricks. This is basically just an amazing resource for different serverless services that are out there. All this like with different serverless functions and forms and notifications and all of those different tools that I talked about before for getting different types of data into your site. So I highly recommend that resource. It's just chock full. And always there's GitHub documentation on Angular Universal. It's the comments and issues on there are really interesting to see, one, where the technology is going, and what they're working on right now. And as you may know, the Angular roadmap is public now. So they're trying to do more to let us know what their time is being spent on, and so what we can know the information, if there's information that we need, if it's coming or not. But definitely check that out. There's a lot of discussions in there. And then I'm actually releasing an audio version of the modern web development on the Jamstack book. So keep your ear to the ground for that. And one of my favorite things is me and my team do Remotely Interesting podcast, where we talk about different aspects. And the next episode that we do in 2 weeks is actually going to be on server-side rendering and on rendering in the Jamstack and comparing those. So if you're interested in this, I think you will like that episode. And we also, again, try to be remotely interesting. So I hope you check that out. Again, thank you so much for joining me today. I hope I at least gave you a little more insight on some aspects of rendering. And I'm always here if you have any questions, and I hope to see you November 16th for the workshop. So thank you so much for hanging out with me, and feel free to ping me if you have any questions.
It was awesome. Thank you, Tara.